As the Austro-Hungarian Empire sank into the most shocking scandal of the century, the Mayerling incident, all of Europe turned its back on one woman. While Princess Stéphanie, the lawful wife, had to confront the brutal truth that her husband, Crown Prince Rudolf, had killed himself alongside his 17-year-old mistress, the world romanticized the very person who had replaced her. It was this public humiliation, this cruel irony that she was the wife, yet was made the superfluous one, that defined her fate. Who was she? The future empress once coveted by all of Europe, or the forgotten victim of history? But this is not the story of a passive woman who accepted her fate. This is the story of someone who was stripped of everything, her future, her honor, and even her very role in the tragedy, drowned by a love myth she was never part of, and left to live out her days in obscurity. Stéphanie Clotilde Louise Hermine Marie Charlotte was born on May 21st, 1864, not into an ancient dynasty, but a new and ambitious one, the Belgian house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. She was the second daughter, which, in the eyes of her father, King Leopold II, was her first failure. Her older sister Louise had already been a disappointment. The new dynasty, obsessed with securing its legitimacy, demanded a male heir. Her childhood home, the Palace of Laeken, was an Arctic void. Her parents' marriage was a notorious disaster, a cold political merger between two incompatible people. Her father, Leopold II, was a man of sociopathic ambition, a king who saw his family as assets and the world as a source of profit. While Stéphanie was in the nursery, he was busy creating his personal brutal empire in the Congo. He was cold, calculating, and contemptuous of his family. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, was a passionate, horse-obsessed Habsburg archduchess who, in the face of her husband's coldness and philandering, retreated almost entirely from court life and her children, finding her only solace in the royal stables. Into this loveless dynamic Stéphanie was born. The family's fragile structure shattered completely in 1869, when she was just 4. Her younger brother, the 9-year-old heir, Prince Leopold, fell into a pond, caught pneumonia, and died an agonizing death. This tragedy did not unite the family, it destroyed it. Leopold II, incandescent with grief and rage, viciously and publicly blamed his wife for the death of his only son. From that moment, he effectively abandoned his family, treating his daughters as inconvenient, useless reminders of his lost heir. Stéphanie's upbringing became a study in paradox. It was both incredibly harsh and remarkably shallow. The goal was not to educate her, but to market her. She and her sister were taught languages, French, German, English, and even Hungarian, not for intellectual enrichment, but to make polite, empty conversation with future royal suitors. They were drilled in deportment, music, and drawing, not as forms of art, but as accomplishments to be displayed, like parlor tricks, to prove their value as high-status wives. Intellectually, her education was a void. She was taught no history, no politics, no science, and no mathematics. Her father was carving up a continent, and she was taught nothing of the world. Her mind was to be kept placid, obedient, and unformed. The discipline, meanwhile, was medieval. For minor infractions, the princesses were forced to kneel for hours on dried peas or were locked in dark rooms. Worse than the physical hardship was the emotional starvation. Her mother was a distant, grieving figure, and her father, on the rare occasions he saw his daughters, would openly mock their appearance, criticizing their clothes and gawky frames. Stéphanie grew up in a palace that was a psychological prison. She was shy, serious, and starved of affection, desperate for a single word of approval. She was taught one single crushing lesson from the moment her brother died. Her only value, her one and only purpose in life, lay in the dynastic marriage she would one day make. She was not a person. She was a pawn waiting to be moved. And in 1880, the most powerful chess player on the board decided he wanted her. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was the ancient, crumbling, magnificent heart of Europe. It was ruled by the oldest and most prestigious dynasty of all, the Habsburgs. For 600 years, they had ruled Central Europe, and at its head sat the unwavering Emperor Franz Joseph I. His son and heir was the Crown Prince Rudolf. If Stéphanie's father Leopold was a creature of cold calculation, Rudolf was a creature of fire and storm. He was, in a word, a mess. Rudolf was fiercely intelligent, charming, and a political progressive. He had been given a rigorous, forward-thinking education by his tutors, and as a result, he despised his father's conservative Catholic traditionalism. He believed the multi-ethnic, multilingual empire was doomed unless it modernized, unless it embraced liberalism. He secretly wrote anonymous, liberal-leaning articles for newspapers, dreaming of a more modern federalist empire. But he was also deeply unstable. He drank heavily. He was a notorious compulsive womanizer, constantly surrounded by a cohort of disreputable friends, journalists, and endless mistresses. He was fascinated by science, but also by death, indulging in morbid, philosophical conversations about suicide. And he was, like Stéphanie, under immense crushing pressure. His father, the emperor, cared nothing for his son's political ideas. He demanded one thing, an heir. The dynasty required a wife, a marriage, and a son in that order. In 1880, Rudolf, then 21 years old, was sent on a tour of the European courts to find a suitable bride. The list of available Catholic princesses was depressingly short. The field had been narrowed down to the Saxon princesses, or the Belgian ones. Rudolf went to Brussels first. He met Stéphanie at the Belgian court. She was 15 years old, about to turn 16. She was tall for her age, a little awkward, and utterly, completely terrified. She had been dressed, prepped, and presented. Rudolf, the heir to the glittering Austrian throne, was the most dazzling, important man she had ever met. He was the physical opposite of her father, charming, witty, and intense. Rudolf, for his part, was not impressed. He went back and wrote to his former tutor, complaining that she was plain and gawky, but his father was insistent. The Belgian royal house was new, but it was rich, thanks to the Congo, though no one spoke of that. It was Catholic, and Stéphanie, crucially, was young and appeared healthy. She would do. Stroking his mustache, Rudolf made his clinical assessment. She was not a beauty, but she was a princess from a correct house. The political alliance would be strong. She would, he assumed, be an obedient and fertile wife. He proposed. For Stéphanie, the moment was not one of political calculation. It was a miracle. This brilliant, handsome prince, the heir to the empire of empires, had chosen her. He was her escape. He was the man who would finally rescue her from the Belgian icebox, from her cold father and her absent mother. He was, she thought, the prince from a fairy tale, the one who would finally give her the life she had dreamed of. She fell instantly and deeply in love. Her engagement was announced on March 7th, 1880. The Belgian court was ecstatic. Leopold II had done it. He had taken his useless daughter and married her into the most powerful, most ancient dynasty in the world. He had made his greatest political merger. Stéphanie, just 16 years old, was sent from Brussels to Vienna to be prepared for her wedding. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, a place of profound unhappiness, for a future she believed would be one of unbridled joy. She was utterly, tragically unprepared. The fairy tale was about to end, and the furnace of the Viennese court was waiting. The engagement was a miracle, a seeming escape from the cold, psychological prison of her father's court. But Stéphanie was merely trading one cage for another, one far older, more rigid, and infinitely more cruel. She had left the calculated indifference of Brussels only to enter the suffocating, protocol-obsessed world of the Habsburgs. She was no longer a pawn in her father's new dynasty. She was now a sacrificial lamb for Europe's oldest, and a court ruled by an unsmiling emperor and an empress who would become her greatest tormentor. Stéphanie, just 16 years old, was sent from the Belgian icebox to the Viennese furnace. She arrived in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a conquering heroine, the future empress. The crowds cheered, cannons were fired, and the city was draped in the combined flags of Belgium and the Habsburg monarchy. For a young girl who had known only the cold criticism of her father and the indifferent absence of her mother, this wave of public adoration was intoxicating. She was, for the first time in her life, wanted. She believed with the desperate, naive hope of a teenager that her fairy tale had truly begun. The reality that met her inside the palace walls was, however, not a fairy tale. It was a machine. The Habsburg court at the Hofburg Palace was not a home. It was a fortress of tradition, the most formal, archaic, and suffocating etiquette machine on the planet. Life was governed by a centuries-old code of conduct known as the Spanish's Hofzeremoniell, or Spanish court ceremonial. It was a rigid, unbending system that dictated every moment of the day, from how one dressed, a specific uniform, for nearly every hour, to who one could speak to, how one bowed, and even how one ate. There was no spontaneity, no warmth, and no privacy. Every hallway was patrolled by chamberlains, every word was overheard by ladies-in-waiting, and every action was analyzed for its adherence to protocol. Stéphanie had escaped one loveless court only to be dropped into another, one that was infinitely more complex and far less forgiving. Her new father-in-law, the Emperor Franz Joseph I, was the living embodiment of this system. He was not a man, he was an institution. He rose before dawn every day, worked tirelessly at his desk as the first bureaucrat of the empire, and saw his family, as he saw his territories, as parts of a grand imperial duty. He was polite to his new daughter-in-law, but he was cold, distant, and unapproachable. He offered her no fatherly comfort, only the expectation that she, too, would now perform her duty. But the emperor's coldness was a gentle breeze compared to the Arctic hurricane of her new mother-in-law, the Empress Elizabeth, known to the world as Sisi. Sisi was, by 1880, one of the 19th century's great icons and one of its great tragedies. Famed for her otherworldly beauty, her ankle-length chestnut hair, and a waistline so tiny, rumored to be 19 inches, that it was maintained through starvation diets and a pathological exercise regime. Sisi was a woman who had long since checked out of her own life. She detested the formalities of the court, which she called her prison. She traveled constantly and restlessly to Hungary, to England for fox hunting, to her palace in Corfu, writing depressive second-rate poetry and doing anything she could to avoid her husband and her responsibilities. She had little time for her children, including Rudolph, whose harsh militaristic education she had been unable to prevent. When she met her new 16-year-old daughter-in-law, she was not welcoming. She was, in fact, appallingly cruel. Sisi was a snob on a level that was almost unimaginable. She, a Wittelsbach from Bavaria, looked down on Stéphanie's upstart Belgian family, the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, as little more than bourgeois merchants who had stolen a throne. She saw Stéphanie not as a lonely, terrified girl, but as a clumsy, artless representative of the very court she despised. Sisi looked at Stéphanie, who was tall, a little awkward in her new grand dresses, and not a classical beauty, and gave her a nickname. She called her Die Trampeltier, the clumsy camel. It was not a private jest. Sisi used it openly in front of the court, in front of the servants. The empress, the icon of grace and beauty, was openly mocking her new daughter's appearance and deportment. For Stéphanie, who had been raised on her own father's insults about her looks, this was a devastating psychological blow. She was immediately branded as inadequate, a clumsy, oafish girl who did not belong. The entire court, which took its cues from the empress, followed suit. Stéphanie was excluded, whispered about, and treated with a subtle, chilling disdain. Trapped between a father-in-law who was a living statue and a mother-in-law who was a beautiful, malevolent ghost, Stéphanie clung to the one person she thought was her savior, Rudolph. The wedding on May 10th, 1881 was the event of the season. It was a staggering display of imperial pomp and power held in the Augustinian church in Vienna. Carriages, soldiers, glittering tiaras, and the assembled royalty of Europe. Stéphanie, just shy of her 17th birthday, was a sacrificial lamb dressed in white silk and silver. She was, as her father-in-law noted with approval, calm and dutiful. She was in reality petrified. Her wedding night was a disaster. It was a trauma that would scar her for the rest of her life. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, in her distant, horse-obsessed world, had given her zero information about the facts of life. Her harsh, religious-based education had taught her that such things were not to be spoken of, or even thought of. She was, by her own admission in her memoirs, completely ignorant of what a husband and wife did. The experience with Rudolph, who was an experienced, jaded, and not particularly gentle lover, was terrifying. She wrote later that she felt she would die of fright and pain. It was a brutal introduction to married life, and it colored her entire perception of intimacy. Sex, for Stéphanie, was not an act of love. It was a frightening, painful, and confusing duty to be endured. Despite this horrific start, for a brief time they tried. Rudolph, for all his deep-seated flaws, could be incredibly charming. He was witty, intelligent, and when he wanted to be, deeply engaging. Stéphanie, for all her naivety, was desperate to please, desperate to prove her worth, and finally earn the love she had always been denied. She threw herself into the one role Sisi had abandoned. She became the perfect crown princess. She stood by her husband at openings, at receptions, at military reviews. She learned to navigate the complex, multi-ethnic politics of the empire, dutifully smiling at Hungarian counts, Polish landowners, and Czech nobles. She was, in every public way, a model of royal duty, and crucially, she did her duty. In 1883, after 2 years of marriage, Stéphanie gave birth to a child at Luxembourg Palace. The empire held its breath. The dynasty needed an heir. The succession, the future of the Habsburgs, rested on this one birth. It was a girl, a useless girl. She was named Elizabeth Marie, known to the family as Erci. For Rudolph, the birth of a daughter was the final disappointment. He had been present, which was unusual for the time, and had apparently been supportive. But the outcome was a dynastic failure. He had his dynastic proof, an heir, but not the heir. And now he was done. The marriage, which had been fragile at best, now completely disintegrated. It had been built on a foundation of political expedience and Stéphanie's one-sided, childish infatuation. Now that foundation was gone. Rudolph, who had been bored by his wife's lack of intellectual depth, now saw her as a failure. She had failed to give him the son that might have, in his mind, finally impressed his father. He plunged back into his life of debauchery with a renewed, frantic, and self-destructive energy. His life, which had always been split, now broke in two. By day, he was the crown prince, trapped in a political system he loathed. By night, he was a different man, exploring the darkest corners of Vienna. He drank more, took more drugs, likely morphine, to which he was becoming addicted, and his collection of mistresses grew. He wasn't just a womanizer. He was a compulsive sex addict seeking validation and escape in a dizzying, endless string of affairs, from high-born countesses to actresses and prostitutes. Stéphanie, isolated in the palace, was aware of his reputation. It was humiliating, but it was, in the 19th century royal world, sadly typical. She was the crown princess. She had her child. She was expected to look the other way. And then Rudolph did something unforgivable. He did something that moved beyond the realm of infidelity and became a permanent physical act of destruction. He contracted a venereal disease. Most historians, based on his symptoms and medical records, are certain it was gonorrhea. And in his recklessness, he gave it to his wife. The infection, in a pre-antibiotic world, was devastating. It ravaged Stéphanie's body, causing severe abdominal pain, fever, and chronic inflammation. But the true horror lay in the patriarchal cruelty of the court. The court doctors, subservient to the crown prince, lied to her. They would not admit that the heir to the throne had given his wife a filthy disease. They told her she was suffering from peritonitis, an inflammation of the abdominal lining. Under this false diagnosis, they subjected her to a series of painful, useless, and likely botched treatments, which may have included surgery. The result of the severe, untreated, or mistreated infection was permanent. The disease or the operations that followed had scarred her fallopian tubes. Stéphanie, at the age of 21, was rendered sterile. She could never have another child. She could never provide the Habsburgs with a male heir. For Stéphanie, this was a betrayal on every conceivable level. It was a physical violation. Her husband, the man she had tried to love, the prince of her fairy tale, had poisoned her. He had destroyed her health. But in the cold, dynastic calculation of the 19th century, he had done something far worse. He had destroyed her purpose, her one value, the one reason her father had sold her, and the one reason the Habsburgs had bought her, was her womb. And now it was useless. She wrote later in her memoirs, with a clarity and coldness that cuts through a century, "I felt a deep, mortal offense. I did not, and I could not, forgive him." The marriage was over. They were no longer husband and wife. They were two people, trapped in the same imperial cage, bound together by a title and a mutual simmering resentment. They lived separate lives. She would travel to the coast for her health, a euphemism for recovering from the damage he had done to her. He would fall deeper into his world of alcohol, morphine, and morbid obsession. Rudolph, meanwhile, was spinning out of control. The disease had also ravaged his own body, leaving him with chronic pain, failing eyesight, and a deeper reliance on drugs. He was politically neutered by his father, who dismissed all his liberal ideas. He was trapped in a marriage he hated, to a woman he had irreparably wronged. He became increasingly, openly obsessed with death. He began asking his friends and mistresses dark, philosophical questions about the logic of suicide. He even approached his long-term mistress, a procuress, an actress named Mitzi Casper, with a shocking proposal, a double suicide pact. He wanted them to die together in a blaze of romantic, tragic glory. Mitzi, a pragmatic woman of the world, laughed at him. She thought he was drunk. She not only refused, but, terrified, She went to the Vienna police president to report that the crown prince was a danger to himself. The police president, horrified, did nothing. How could he accuse the heir to the throne of being mentally unstable? Rudolf was humiliated. His grand gesture had been rejected. But he was not deterred. He just needed to find a different partner. He found her in a 17-year-old baroness named Mary Vetsera. Mary was a young, excitable, and deeply romantic girl from a new money aristocratic family. She was, in the modern sense, a groupie. She had been infatuated with the crown prince from afar, collecting pictures of him, tracking his movements. Through a series of winks and nudges, facilitated by one of Rudolph's disreputable cousins, and even Cece's own lady-in-waiting, Mary was introduced to Rudolph. The affair began. For Rudolph, she was a distraction, but for Mary, she was living a fairy tale. She was the secret lover of the handsome, tragic prince. She was, unlike Mitzi Casper, not a pragmatist. She was a child, and she was as obsessed with the idea of romantic tragedy as Rudolph was with the idea of death. When he inevitably proposed his dark, romantic fantasy to her, a suicide pact, an escape from this cruel world, she did not laugh. She did not go to the police. She agreed. The stage was set for the tragedy that would echo through history, the event that would destroy a family, shake an empire, and permanently, irrevocably, define the life of the lonely woman in the palace. The name is now synonymous with scandal, mystery, and death. Mayerling. It was a small, unassuming imperial hunting lodge in the Vienna woods, a rustic, two-story structure that Crown Prince Rudolf had purchased as an escape from the suffocating protocol of the Habsburg. It was his private domain, a place where he could indulge his passions for hunting, drink, and disreputable company, far from the all-seeing eyes of his father. It was here, on January 29, 1889, that he arrived, citing a hunting trip as a cover for the real grim purpose of his journey. He was not alone. He had arranged for his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, to be smuggled out of Vienna and brought to him, hidden under blankets in a carriage. What happened next has been the subject of 1,000 conspiracy theories, from a political double assassination to a drunken brawl. But the truth, pieced together from forensic evidence, Rudolph's own farewell letters, and the court's frantic attempts to cover it up, is stark, ugly, and profoundly selfish. This was no romantic Romeo and Juliet pact. This was a murder-suicide, orchestrated by a 30-year-old man in a fog of depression, alcohol, and morphine, who convinced a deeply infatuated and mentally unstable teenager to join him in his final narcissistic escape. In the early hours of the morning of January 30th, Rudolf, likely drunk and high, took his revolver and shot Mary Vetsera in the head. She died instantly. He then, it seems, did not follow her immediately. He sat with her body. For hours, as the winter dawn broke over the snowy woods, the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire sat with the corpse of his mistress, the air in the small room thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. He composed himself, writing a stack of lucid, clear-headed farewell letters, one to his father, one to his mother, one to his sister, and one to his wife. Only when this final piece of administration was complete did he turn the gun on himself, shattering his own skull. Back in Vienna, the court was frantic. Rudolf had missed a family dinner with the emperor, an unforgivable breach of protocol. Then he missed a scheduled hunting engagement. His valet, Franz Loschek, who had been ordered by Rudolf to not disturb him under any circumstances, grew increasingly terrified. He had heard the two shots hours apart, but had been too intimidated to investigate. Finally, Rudolf's hunting companion, Count Joseph Hoyos, arrived. Together they called to the prince. There was no answer. The door was locked. They broke it down. The scene they discovered was a horror show. It was a domestic slaughterhouse. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dead, slumped by the side of his bed, his body already cold, his skull shattered. And on the bed lay the body of a young woman, also dead, her hands in a final macabre gesture, still clutching a single rose. The first instinct of Count Hoyos was not grief. It was not shock. It was, as it was for the entire Habsburg court, one word: control. This could not get out. The fact that the heir had committed suicide was an existential threat to the dynasty. The fact that he had murdered a teenage baroness first was an unthinkable catastrophe. Hoyos raced to the nearest train station and commandeered a private train to Vienna. He went directly to the Hofburg Palace, not to Stéphanie, the crown prince's wife, but to the emperor's adjutant. The first story was a frantic lie. Rudolf, Hoyos claimed, had died of poison, perhaps administered by his mistress. The truth was too terrible to speak even to the emperor. Emperor Franz Joseph, upon hearing the news, was told by Empress Sisi first. She met him with the news. His stoic, iron-willed self-control was legendary. He reportedly said only, "The heir to the throne has died." His next actions were not those of a grieving father, but of an emperor trying to save his empire from the ultimate scandal. The cover-up began immediately. The first and most grotesque problem was the body of Mary Vetsera. She was a non-person. Her presence at Mayerling was the proof of the crown prince's sin. She had to be erased. The emperor's ministers were summoned. Mary's uncles, Alexander and Balthasar Vetsera, were dragged from their homes and brought to the lodge. They were shown the body of their niece and sworn to absolute secrecy. Then, one of the most horrific episodes in the history of the 19th century court unfolded. Mary's body, already in rigor mortis, had to be removed without the lodge's staff or the public seeing. She was taken from the bed, dressed in her riding clothes, and a hat was jammed onto her head. To keep her from slumping over, a stick or perhaps a piece of wood was wedged up the back of her dress. She was then propped up in a carriage, sitting between her two uncles, as if she were alive, and driven at speed away from the lodge. They took her to the nearby monastery at Heiligenkreuz. There, in the dead of night, with a driving storm of rain and sleet, she was bundled into a pauper's grave, a simple wooden coffin, and buried in a corner of the cemetery. There was no funeral, no priest, no name. The state, in a single brutal act, had erased her from history. With Mary's body disposed of, the court could focus on Rudolf. The first official announcement sent to the public and to the other courts of Europe was that the crown prince had died of heart failure or an aneurysm. But you can't hide an event of this magnitude. The truth in whispers began to leak. The valets had seen the bodies. The doctors who performed the autopsy knew it was a gunshot. The word suicide began to circulate. This was a disaster. A suicide in the deeply Catholic Habsburg Empire was a mortal sin. A person who took their own life could not be buried in consecrated ground. They could not have a state funeral. The emperor was forced to pivot. He petitioned the Pope in Rome, asking for a special dispensation. The official news story was that the crown prince, in a fit of madness or mental imbalance, had taken his own life. This, and only this, would allow him the Catholic burial his station demanded. The murder of Mary Vetsera was never, ever mentioned. And what of Stéphanie? She was at home, in her own palace in Vienna, completely oblivious. She was 24 years old. The initial reports given to her were the official lies. An adjutant arrived and informed her that her husband, the crown prince, had suffered a heart stroke. She was plunged into the sudden, confusing shock of widowhood. She prepared to mourn a man who had died of natural causes. But the lies could not hold. The court was in chaos, rumors were flying, and in her confusion Stéphanie made a fateful decision. She went to the Habsburg palace to see her mother-in-law, Empress Sisi, believing they would share their grief. The scene that followed was one of pure, unadulterated cruelty. Sisi, herself in a state of profound theatrical shock, was pacing her chambers. When Stéphanie entered, dressed in her new mourning clothes, the Empress did not embrace her. She did not offer a word of comfort. She turned on her, her voice a snarl. "How dare you come before me?" she allegedly hissed. "What are you doing here? You are the one who caused this. It is your fault." In her agony, Sisi needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame for the destruction of her son. And Stéphanie, the clumsy camel, the plain wife Rudolph had never loved, the woman who had failed to keep him happy, was the perfect target. For Stéphanie, this was the moment the ground gave way. She was not just a widow. She was, in the eyes of the court and her family, the reason for the tragedy. It was only later that she was given the full, horrifying truth, likely by the emperor himself. Her husband had not died of a heart attack. He had killed himself. And he had not died alone. In his desk at Mayerling, Rudolph had left his stack of letters. And in that stack was one for his wife. If the disease he gave her was a betrayal, and his suicide a public humiliation, this letter was a final twisting of the knife. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was an absolution, written by a man so deep in his own self-pity that he couldn't see, even in his final moments, the woman he had destroyed. He wrote simply, "Dear Stéphanie, you are rid of my presence and plague. Be happy in your own way. You are rid of my presence." He had not only killed himself, he had killed her. In that moment, with those few cold words, her identity vanished. She was no longer the crown princess, a role with a difficult present, but a glorious guaranteed future. She was no longer the future Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. She was nothing. She was a 24-year-old widow, sterile, in a foreign court that had always despised her, now tainted by the ultimate, unforgivable scandal. Her purpose, the one she had been trained for, the one she had been sold for, was gone. Her father-in-law, the Emperor Franz Joseph, was dutiful as ever. He would not abandon the widow of his son. That would be another scandal, but he was cold. He insisted she remain in Austria, at the court. She was still a Habsburg, and more importantly, she was the mother of his granddaughter, Erci, who was now second in line to the throne, after the emperor's brother and nephew. Stéphanie's new duty was to be a living, breathing monument to her own failure. Her mother-in-law, Empress Sisi, reacted with a bizarre, theatrical grief, dressing in black from head to toe, which she would wear for the rest of her life. She called herself a woman who is already dead. But this grief never, not for 1 second, extended to her daughter-in-law. Sisi, who had also lost her son, never spoke a single word of comfort to Stéphanie. She simply treated her as an inconvenient, tainted reminder of the family's shame. Even her own father, King Leopold II, was no refuge. He was enraged. A failed princess, a widow of a scandalous suicide, was a blemish on his reputation, a terrible return on his investment. He would not have her back in Belgium. She was trapped. She was a prisoner of her title, with no role, no future, and no hope. She was a public figure with no private life, a royal with no power. Her life as she had known it was over. She was the woman who had failed to be an empress, and now she was just the widow. The gunshots at Mayerling on January 30th, 1889, did not just kill Crown Prince Rudolph and his teenage mistress. For all practical purposes, they killed Crown Princess Stéphanie. In her place, a new spectral figure was created, ihre kaiserliche und königliche Hoheit, die verwitwete Kronprinzessin. Her Imperial and Royal Highness the Dowager Crown Princess. It was a title that was a constant public reminder of what she had lost. At 24 years old, her life as it had been defined by dynastic purpose was over. For the next 11 years, Stéphanie of Belgium would walk the halls of the Habsburg Palace as a ghost. Her existence became one of suffocating emptiness, a public performance of grief for a man she had come to despise in a court that viewed her as a failure. She was trapped. Her father, King Leopold II, wouldn't have her back in Belgium. A failed princess, a sterile widow tainted by scandal, was a blemish on his reputation and a worthless asset. The Austrian court, ruled by her iron-willed father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, didn't want her, but wouldn't let her go. She was the mother of Archduchess Elisabeth Marie Ercy, who was now the emperor's de facto ward. Stéphanie's new duty was to remain a living monument to the family's shame. Her mother-in-law, Empress Sisi, who had once called her the clumsy camel, now cemented her role as Stéphanie's chief tormentor. Sisi, in a profound theatrical and narcissistic display of grief, dressed in black from head to toe, carried a black parasol, and declared herself a woman who is already dead. This grief, however, never extended to her daughter-in-law. Sisi, who had lost her son, never spoke a single word of comfort to Stéphanie. Instead, she doubled down on her cruelty, openly blaming Stéphanie for Rudolph's unhappiness, for his despair, and, by extension, for his suicide. In Sisi's warped narrative, if Stéphanie had only been more beautiful, more charming, more like her, Rudolph would have been saved. Stéphanie was forced to endure this silent daily accusation from a woman who was herself a phantom at court. Stéphanie's days were a meaningless ritual. She traveled. She oversaw her daughter's education. Though Ercy was quickly and systematically removed from her mother's influence and turned into a true Habsburg, she was a public figure with no private life, a royal with no power, a 20-something woman living the sequestered life of an old-world dowager. She was, in every sense, a prisoner of her title. In this gilded cage she tried briefly to find solace. She was, after all, a young woman starved of the affection her father had never given and her husband had poisoned. She began a discreet, loving relationship with a Polish nobleman, Count Artur Potocki. He was, in many ways, the antithesis of Rudolph. He was gentle, cultured, and, most importantly, he was kind to her. For a fleeting moment in the shadows of her official life, Stéphanie found a sliver of happiness. But her life, it seemed, was cursed. Just as she was finding a precarious foothold of joy, tragedy struck again. Potocki was diagnosed with throat cancer. This was not the swift, violent end of Mayerling, but a slow, agonizing decay. Stéphanie, the clumsy camel who had been dismissed as shallow, proved her strength. She nursed him devotedly, sitting by his bedside, offering comfort as the disease consumed him. When he died in 1890, just a year after Mayerling, it was a second profound blow. The one man who had shown her genuine disinterested love was gone. It was a terrible confirmation of her isolation. The court, meanwhile, was already moving on. An empire needs an heir, and the Habsburgs were nothing if not pragmatic. With Rudolph gone, the line of succession passed to the emperor's brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, and after him, to his son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yes, that Franz Ferdinand. Karl Ludwig was a pious, aging man. The true future of the dynasty now rested on his son, and Franz Ferdinand was a problem. He was stubborn, ill-tempered, brooding, and possessed a will that was as iron as the emperor's. He was also, in 1898, the most eligible bachelor in the world. The court needed to get him married, and it needed to secure the succession. And here history offers one of its most fascinating what-ifs. The Emperor Franz Joseph, ever the pragmatist, developed a new plan. He looked at his court and saw two pieces that didn't fit. He had a spare, difficult heir, Franz Ferdinand, and he had a spare, used Archduchess Stéphanie. Why not marry Stéphanie to Franz Ferdinand? The plan was seriously considered. On paper, it was a stroke of Habsburg genius. It would solve Stéphanie's problem, giving her a new powerful role. It would, at last, make her the future empress she was always supposed to be. And it would provide the difficult Franz Ferdinand with a wife of equal rank, a former crown princess no less, who had already proven she could at least once bear a child. Imagine it. Stéphanie, finally, as the wife of the true heir. She would have become empress. She would have been standing next to him in Sarajevo. But the plan was doomed from the start, for two very human reasons. First, Franz Ferdinand, stubborn and difficult, had already fallen desperately, secretly, and obsessively in love with a woman who was unacceptable, a mere countess from minor Czech nobility named Sophie Chotek. He would not be swayed. He would fight his uncle, the emperor, for years, risking his title, his inheritance, and his children's future, all to marry his forbidden love. He had no interest in the clumsy widow of his cousin Rudolph. Second, and more importantly, Stéphanie had changed. She was no longer the 16-year-old girl who believed in fairy tales. She was a 35-year-old woman who had survived an abusive father, a monstrous husband, a venereal disease, a public scandal, and the scorn of an entire empire. Having lived through one disastrous arranged marriage, she had absolutely no taste for another, especially not to a man as famously sour and difficult as Franz Ferdinand. The plan failed, and with it, Stéphanie's last tenuous link to the Habsburg throne was severed. She was now truly, completely on her own. It was in this isolation, in this widow's wilderness, that she finally found her strength. She had spent her entire life doing what others told her. She had been her father's pawn. She had been Rudolph's dynastic vessel. She had been the emperor's political problem. Now, she would be her own woman. And then she met a man. He wasn't a prince. He wasn't an heir. He wasn't a powerful political figure. He was Count Elimer Lonier de Nagy-Lonya. He was a Hungarian diplomat from a noble but minor family. He was 10 years her senior. He was intelligent, cultured, and, most revolutionary of all, he was stable. He was a quiet, kind, and steady man, and he was in love with her, not with her imperial and royal highness, not with the future empress, but with Stéphanie, the woman. He saw the person who had survived, not the ghost who haunted the Hofburg. For Stéphanie, this was everything. This was the love she had been denied her entire life. This was the love of an Artur Potocki, but with a future. She made a decision. It was, in its own way, more shocking, more radical, and more defiant than the gunshots at Mayerling. She, the dowager crown princess of the mighty Habsburg Empire, would give it all up. To marry Elimer, she had to ask Emperor Franz Joseph's permission. This wasn't a formality, it was a resignation. She had to formally renounce her title. She would no longer be her imperial and royal highness. She would no longer be a Habsburg. She would lose her status, her palaces, her place in the line of precedence, and, most critically, her massive state allowance. She would even, in essence, be giving up her daughter, as Ersi would remain a ward of the emperor. She would be trading the gilded cage of the imperial court for the uncertain, common life of a mere countess. She, who had been raised to be nothing but a title, was choosing to become a person. She went to the emperor. We can only imagine the scene. Stéphanie, 36 years old, standing before the old man who was the living embodiment of the 19th century. Franz Joseph was, by 1900, a man besieged by tragedy. He had lost his son to suicide in 1889. He had lost his brother, Karl Ludwig. And in 1898, his wife, the wandering Empress Sisi, had finally met her tragic end, assassinated in Geneva by an Italian anarchist. He was an old, tired, and lonely man, and now his son's widow was asking to resign. Perhaps he was just too weary to fight. Perhaps in a small hidden part of his bureaucratic heart, he respected this act of will. He granted his permission. He was most likely relieved to have her problem, and her constant, painful reminder of Rudolph finally solved. The court was stunned. The clumsy camel was walking away from the imperial throne, but there was one man who was not merely stunned. He was apoplectic. Her father, King Leopold II of the Belgians. Leopold back in Brussels was incandescent with rage. This was not a father's concern. This was the fury of a CEO whose prize asset just declared itself worthless. To him, this was the ultimate betrayal. A daughter of Belgium, the widow of a crown prince, a Habsburg, throwing it all away to marry a Hungarian nobody. A groom, he called him with utter contempt. It was a public humiliation of him. It was a terrible return on investment. He forbade the marriage. He sent her letters, messages, and threats demanding she obey her father and her king. Stéphanie, now 36 years old, the Wams who had survived the Habsburgs, was not about to be stopped by the father who had abandoned her. She defied him. She married Elimer Launier in a quiet ceremony at Miramar Castle. Ironically, the former home of another tragic Habsburg, Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, on March 22, 1900. Her new husband, in a final gesture of devotion that proved the quality of their union, had even converted from his native Calvinism to her Catholic faith. He was joining her, not the other way around. Leopold's revenge was swift, total, and brutal. He was a man who knew how to destroy things. He had already destroyed millions of lives in the Congo. Now he would destroy his daughter. He disowned her. He declared her persona non grata in Belgium. She was, in his eyes, no longer his child. He cut her off financially, completely. He was one of the richest men in the world, and she was now, in his eyes, a pauper. He was certain this would break her, that she would come crawling back. But the cruelty was bottomless. When Stéphanie's mother, Queen Marie Henriette, died in 1902, Stéphanie was forbidden from traveling to Brussels. She was barred, by order of her own father, from attending her own mother's funeral. When Leopold II himself lay dying in 1909, he continued his reign of terror. Stéphanie and her older sister Louise, who had also been disowned after her own series of scandals, rushed to Brussels. They waited outside the palace gates, begging to see their father one last time. He refused, snarling from his deathbed that his daughters were not to be admitted. And when his will was read, the final insult was revealed. Leopold II, whose plundering of the Congo had made him a billionaire in modern terms, left his entire vast fortune to his young mistress, Caroline Lacroix, and to a series of trusts controlled by the Belgian state for his building projects. His daughters Stéphanie and Louise were left with almost nothing. It was the final act of cruelty from a father who had never loved her, a final attempt to beggar her from beyond the grave. But Leopold II had underestimated his daughter. She was no longer the terrified girl in the Laeken Palace. She was no longer the clumsy camel of the Hofburg. She was Countess Launier, and she was a fighter. She and her sister did the unthinkable. They sued the Belgian state. The great inheritance battle became a massive, messy international legal scandal that dragged on for years. The two failed princesses, the outcasts of Europe, took on their father's legacy and the entire Belgian government. Finally, in 1914, just as the world was about to catch fire, a settlement was reached. Stéphanie and Louise won. They were not given the full vast fortune, but they were given enough. Stéphanie was at last financially free. She had beaten her father. For Stéphanie, her real life began at 36. She and Elemer, now with her inheritance secured, settled at Orosvar Castle, or Rusovce, in Hungary, now part of Slovakia. It was a beautiful sprawling estate, far from the suffocating, icy courts of Brussels and Vienna. And for the first time in her life, she was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. She and Elemer lived the quiet, peaceful life of wealthy, landed aristocrats. They were part of the vast cosmopolitan world of the Austro-Hungarian elite, a life of hunting, house parties, and travel. In a charming and quirky historical footnote, Stéphanie, now Countess Launier, even became an inventor. This woman, who had been raised to do nothing, to create nothing, and to be nothing but a symbol, applied for and received patents for a new, combined chafing dish and spirit lamp. It was a high-tech piece of dining equipment for its day, an elegant and practical solution for keeping food warm during long aristocratic dinners. The symbolism is almost too perfect. A woman whose entire dynastic purpose had been to serve her father's ambition, to serve her husband's line, to serve an empire's need for an heir, was now, in her free life, redesigning the very dishes that purpose was served upon. She, who had seen her own life go cold, was now inventing a way to keep the warmth in. It was a small act, but a profound declaration of her new practical and self-defined existence. Stéphanie, now 40 years old, was finally simply free. Her marriage to Elemer Launier was her true happily ever after, a quiet victory of personal will over dynastic cruelty. But this hard-won peace was a small island of domestic bliss in a world that was hurtling toward a new kind of violence. She had survived the 19th century, but now she would have to survive the 20th. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man who had refused her, and his unacceptable wife, Sophie Chotek, were assassinated in Sarajevo. The gunshots that killed the heir and his wife ignited the July crisis, and within weeks the great powers of Europe, bound by their web of alliances and imperial ambitions, had plunged the continent into a war of unimaginable scale. The Great War, World War I, had begun. For Stéphanie, the war was not a distant political event. It was the assassination of a man she knew intimately, a man who had been her cousin by marriage. It was a war against the empire she had married into, and a war that involved the Belgium she had been born into, which was almost immediately and brutally invaded by Germany. Stéphanie, now 50 years old, did not hide. She was not the cowering, terrified girl of the Habsburg. She was the mistress of Orosvar. She immediately converted a large part of her beloved castle into a field hospital. She, the former crown princess of Austria-Hungary, donned a nurse's uniform and, working with the Red Cross, spent the next 4 years tending to the shattered, wounded, and dying soldiers brought back from the front lines. The woman who had been mocked as the clumsy camel now showed a strength and resilience that shamed her former tormentors. In 1917, in one of the last acts of the dying Austro-Hungarian Empire, the new emperor, Karl I, Franz Joseph's grandnephew who had taken the throne, after the old emperor's death in 1916, formally elevated Stéphanie's husband Elemer to the rank of first, or prince. It was a gesture of profound respect, not just for Elemer's loyal service, but for Stéphanie's. And so in a final strange twist of fate, Stéphanie, who had given up her imperial title, now had a new one. She was Fürstin Launier, Princess Elémère Launier. The title came just as the world that had created it was being obliterated. The end of the war in 1918 brought the end of everything she had ever known. The Habsburg Empire was dismantled. The German Empire was gone. The Russian Empire was gone. The Ottoman Empire was gone. The ancient 600-year-old dynasty she had married into, the one that had defined and destroyed her youth, ceased to exist. Austria became a small, struggling republic. Hungary, where she lived, was carved up. Her world was gone. Stéphanie and Elémère, now in their 60s, lived on quietly in their castle, survivors of a bygone age, remnants of a lost world. They were aristocrats, and now they were anachronisms. But her life had one more tragedy in store. The collapse of empires was a political tragedy, a distant rumble. This next one was intimate. It was perhaps the most painful of all. It involved her daughter, Erzsébet, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, the Red Archduchess. Rudolph's daughter, the child of Mayerling, had grown up just as rebellious, just as volatile, and just as stubborn as her father. She had been raised by her grandfather, the Emperor Franz Joseph, and was, by all accounts, his favorite grandchild. But under the surface, she was a true child of Rudolph, not Stéphanie. She felt trapped by her Habsburg name, and she despised the mother she barely knew, the clumsy woman who had failed her brilliant, tragic father. Like her mother, Erzsé's first marriage was a dynastic one to a Prince Otto von Windisch-Gratz, and, like her mother, she was desperately unhappy. She too fell in love with another man. And, in an echo of her mother's own rebellion, she chose to leave her husband and her privileged life for the man she truly loved. But her choice was not a kind, noble Hungarian diplomat. Her choice was infinitely more scandalous. Her new love was a man named Leopold Petzneck. And Petzneck wasn't just a commoner. He was a committed, leading socialist. In the 1920s, in the fractured, politically violent world of post-war Austria, this was not a social faux pas. This was an act of class, political, and familial treason. Erzsébet, the granddaughter of the last great emperor, the daughter of the tragic crown prince, renounced her titles. She joined the Social Democratic Party. She became a political activist, Comrade Petzneck, marching in parades, giving speeches, and dedicating her life to the very political movement that the aristocracy saw as a godless, immoral, and dangerous threat to civilization. For Stéphanie, this was a betrayal too far. She was a devout Catholic. She was a product of the old order. She was now Princess Launier. She could understand, my God, she could understand better than anyone, marrying for love. She could understand giving up a title for happiness. She could not and would not forgive this. This was not a private choice. This was a public, political, and in her eyes, godless rejection of everything. It was a public embrace of the very forces that had destroyed her world. She saw it as an insult to her faith, her class, and, most of all, to the memory of the Habsburgs she had, for all her suffering, been a part of. The mother and daughter, who had been bound by the shared tragedy of Mayerling, were now driven apart by the new, brutal ideologies of the 20th century. They had a final bitter confrontation in 1925. The two women, the survivor of the 19th century and the revolutionary of the 20th, met, and the gulf between them was unbridgeable. They would never see each other again. In 1935, Stéphanie, now 71 years old, published her memoirs, Ich sollte Kaiserin werden. I should have been empress. It was her attempt, in her old age, to finally tell her side of the story, to reclaim her own narrative from the long, dark shadow of Rudolf and Mayerling. The book was a sensation and a scandal. In it, she was not kind. She was not forgiving. She painted her dead husband as the monster he had been to her. She described in unflinching detail his cruelty, his debauchery, and the mortal offense of the disease he had given her, the disease that had made her sterile and destroyed her life's purpose. She was settling the score from half a century earlier. The European press was horrified. The Habsburgs were disgusted, but for Stéphanie it was the truth. It was her truth. But her story had one final cruel chapter, one last echo of the political violence that had always surrounded her. In 1944, the world was at war again, but this time the war was far more personal and far more dangerous. Hungary was occupied by the Nazis. Her daughter, Erzsébet, the Red Archduchess, was now living the consequences of her own choices. Her socialist partner, Leopold Petzneck, had been arrested by the Nazis and sent to the Dachau concentration camp. And Stéphanie, now 80 years old, living in her Hungarian castle, performed her last cold act of maternal rejection. As Erzsébe's life was collapsing under the weight of Nazi terror, Stéphanie formally, legally, disinherited her only child. She cut her out of her will completely, leaving everything to her husband, Elemer, and to the Benedictine order. It was a final, unforgiving act. The war that had taken her daughter's lover was now coming for her. The Soviet Red Army was advancing through Hungary, pushing back the Nazis in a wave of fire and steel. For Stéphanie and Elemer, now 81 and 82, this was not a liberation. This was an apocalypse. They were aristocrats. They were firsts. They were symbols of the old landed world that the new communist order was about to eradicate. They were in mortal danger. They had to flee. In the dead of winter, 1945, the old princess and her prince, who had given up everything for each other, had to abandon their beloved castle. They packed only what they could carry. They became, in the final act of their lives, refugees. They made their way through the chaos and snow to the one place they thought would be safe, the Archabbey of Pannonhalma. Pannonhalma is a massive ancient Benedictine monastery, a fortress of faith that has stood on a hill in Hungary for over 1,000 years. It was a place outside of time, outside of politics. The Archabbot, Kelemen Chrysostom, was a brave man who was already busy hiding hundreds of Jewish refugees, including children, in the monastery's cellars. He gave the elderly, terrified royal couple sanctuary. Stéphanie, Princess of Belgium, Dowager Crown Princess of Austria-Hungary. Princess Lanye was now a refugee, living in a few simple, cold rooms within the monastery walls. She could listen, in the winter quiet, as the thunder of artillery from the advancing Red Army grew closer. The world she had known was, quite literally, being blown to pieces just beyond her window. It was here, in this last safe harbor, that her body finally gave out. She had survived the Belgian icebox. She had survived the Viennese furnace. She had survived her father's cruelty, her husband's poison, the Mayerling scandal, the scorn of an empress, the loss of her lover, the collapse of an empire, and 2 world wars. She had fought for her inheritance and won. She had fought for her happiness and won. On August 23, 1945, just months after the war in Europe had ended, Princess Stéphanie died of a stroke. She was 81 years old. She was buried, not in the imperial crypt in Vienna with the Habsburgs who had despised her, nor in the royal crypt in Belgium with the family that had cast her out, but in the simple, quiet crypt of the monastery that had given her shelter. Her husband, Elemer, the kind, steady man who had given up his career for her and for whom she had given up an empire, was utterly lost without her. He died less than a year later. He was buried right next to her. So, who was Stéphanie of Belgium? History remembers her as a footnote. She is a supporting character, a name in the index of a greater, more tragic story. She is the unlucky wife in the Mayerling scandal. She is the clumsy camel of Sisi's court. She is, by the title of her own memoirs, the woman who failed to be an empress. But this is a profound misreading of her life. Stéphanie's life was not a failure. It was a testament to survival. She was a product of the 19th century's brutal dynastic system, a system that treated royal women as chattel, as walking wombs, as political assets, to be traded, leveraged, and discarded. She was abused by her father, betrayed and poisoned by her husband, and mocked and psychologically tormented by her in-laws. She was handed a script to be a silent, beautiful, air-producing machine. And when that script was torn to pieces by the gunshots at Mayerling, she was left with nothing. She was 24 years old, sterile and a pariah, a ghost in her own life. But instead of collapsing, instead of fading into a convent or sanatorium, she did the most radical thing a royal woman of her time could do. She waited. She endured. And then at 36, she chose. She chose her own happiness over her royal title. She chose a kind man over a powerful one. She gave up the hollow, glittering crown of what might have been for the simple, tangible reality of a life lived in peace. Her father's name, Leopold II, is now a global byword for colonial atrocity and mass murder. Her first husband's name, Rudolf, is a synonym for weakness, scandal, and self-destruction. Her mother-in-law's name, Sisi, is a legend of self-obsessed, tragic beauty. But Stéphanie's name? It's written on a patent for a chafing dish. It's on the lips of the soldiers she nursed in World War I. And it's on a simple tomb in a Hungarian crypt, next to the man she truly loved. She was the woman who was supposed to be an empress, but she accomplished something far more difficult and far more human. She survived them all, and she found a way to be free.